The rain hit her windshield like gravel thrown by a fist. And that was the night Marielle Hartwell almost drove past the two people who would change everything she believed about being alone. A man stood on the shoulder of a dead county road, soaked to the bone, a baby wrapped inside his coat like the last warm thing left in the world. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for a ride to town. He looked at her through the storm and said 4 words that she would remember for the rest of her life. "Can we sleep in your barn?" What she didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that saying yes to a stranger that night would either save her family or finally break it for good. Before we go back to that road, to that rain, to that man with a baby pressed against his chest, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where every instinct told you to keep driving, and something quieter, something older than fear, told you to stop instead? Marielle had built walls around her heart for 3 years. This stranger didn't come to tear them down. He came to remind her they were never meant to be permanent. If you believe kindness can still find its way to broken people, hit like on this video, subscribe if you're new here, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from tonight. Now, let's go back to that barn and to the storm that started it all. Rain in Coulter County didn't fall so much as it arrived, the way an old grief arrives, without knocking, without apology, settling into every crack it could find. On the night everything changed, it came down in sheets so heavy that Marielle Hartwell's truck headlights barely cut 10 feet into the dark. She had the wipers on their fastest setting, and they still couldn't keep up. She was 38 years old, and for 3 years she had been driving this same stretch of Route 9 alone. Ever since the tractor accident took her husband Halden in the spring of a year, she still couldn't say out loud without her voice catching. Before that, this had been their land. 400 acres of soybean and winter wheat, a farmhouse with a wraparound porch Halden built with his own hands, a red barn that had stood since his grandfather's time. After the funeral, people in town had expected her to sell. A widow with no children, they said, quietly, the way people say things they think are kind. She hadn't sold. She'd learned to run a combine herself. She'd learned to fix a busted water pump at 2 in the morning with a flashlight in her teeth. She'd learned, mostly, to be alone in a house built for two. That particular October night, she'd stayed late in town at the feed store, arguing with old Tanner Ruiz, the county deputy who moonlighted delivering grain orders, about a shipment of seed that hadn't come in on time. By the time she left, the sky had already gone the color of a bruise, and the first drops were hitting her windshield before she'd even made it out of the parking lot. She told herself she'd make it home before the worst of it. She did not make it home before the worst of it. 6 miles out, where Route 9 bent hard around what the locals called Miller's Curve, her headlights caught something in the rain that didn't belong there. A shape standing at the edge of the ditch, unmoving, unnatural in its stillness against the storm's violence. Her first instinct, the instinct of a woman who had learned the hard way what solitude teaches you about caution, was to keep her foot steady on the gas and pass by. People didn't stand on dead roads in storms like this unless something had already gone wrong, and wrong things had a way of becoming your problem the moment you slowed down. But then her headlights swept fully across him, and she saw what he was carrying. A baby, small enough that the shape of it was mostly lost inside the folds of his soaked coat. But she saw the movement, a tiny fist, pale in the dark, pushing weakly against fabric that couldn't possibly be keeping the rain out anymore. And she saw the man's face in the half-second her lights crossed him. Not menace, not desperation dressed as danger, but the specific, terrible exhaustion of someone who had run out of anywhere else to be. Marielle's foot came off the gas before her mind had finished deciding. She pulled the truck onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under tires, rain hammering the roof, so loud she could barely hear herself think. For a moment, she just sat there, hands on the wheel, watching the man in her side mirror as he stood frozen, clearly unsure if the truck stopping meant help or trouble. She rolled down her window only a few inches, old habits, old cautions, and called out over the storm. "You need help?" He didn't answer right away. He shifted his weight, adjusted the bundle against his chest, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "My truck broke down about 2 miles back," he said. "I've been walking. My daughter, she's soaked through, and I can't get her warm, and I didn't know if anybody was going to come." Marielle looked at the baby's small fist again, curling and uncurling against the rain. "Get in," she said, and unlocked the door before she'd let herself think twice about what she was doing. His name, she would learn in the next few minutes, was Callan Marsh. He was 34, though the rain and the exhaustion in his eyes made him look older. The baby was his daughter, Junie, 7 months old, and as he climbed into the cab of Marielle's truck, soaked and shaking, cradling that small life against him like it was the only thing keeping him upright too, he said something that Marielle would turn over in her mind for days afterward. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know how this looks. A man alone with a baby on a night like this. I wouldn't blame you for driving on. Most people would have." "I almost did," Marielle admitted, because lying felt wrong in that moment, felt like a small betrayal of whatever had made her stop in the first place. "But your girl needs to be warm. That matters more than anything else right now." She drove them the 6 miles to her farmhouse in near silence. The baby's soft, exhausted whimpers the only sound beneath the rain drumming on the roof. She didn't ask him where he'd come from, or where he was going, or why a man was walking a dead road in a storm with an infant, and, she noticed now, a single duffel bag slung across his shoulder that seemed to hold the whole of what he owned in this world. Some questions, she'd learned since Halden died, needed to wait until a person had stopped shaking long enough to answer them honestly. When they pulled into her long gravel drive and the porch light came into view through the downpour, Callan looked at the house. Warm-lit windows, a barn silhouetted behind it against the black sky, with something that looked almost like disbelief, as if he hadn't quite let himself hope there'd be a place like this at the end of the walking. "Ma'am," he said, before she'd even put the truck in park, "I don't want to put you out. If you've got a barn, that's more than enough. We just need somewhere dry for the night. Can we sleep in your barn?" Marielle turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, rain still drumming overhead, looking at this stranger and his daughter, a man who, offered warmth, had asked for the least of it. She thought of her own house, 4 bedrooms, and only one of them used, a kitchen table built for a family that had never come, silence so complete some nights she talked to the refrigerator hum just to hear something answer back. "No," she said finally. "You're not sleeping in a barn with a baby. Not tonight. Not while I've got a roof with rooms going empty." She would not fully understand, not that night and not for many nights after, that in saying yes to that question, she had opened a door in her life that had been swollen shut for 3 years, and that what walked through it would ask more of her than shelter, and give her back more than she knew how to hold. The farmhouse kitchen smelled like wood smoke, and the chamomile tea Marielle put on the stove without even thinking about it, muscle memory from a life she used to share with someone. Callan sat at the table with Junie against his shoulder, a towel from the hall closet wrapped around them both, and Marielle noticed the way his hands trembled, not entirely from cold, she suspected, but from the particular fatigue of a man who had been carrying more than a baby for longer than one storm. "There's a guest room upstairs," she told him, setting a mug in front of him that he didn't touch. "Made up already, sheets are clean. There's a crib in the attic I can bring down. It was my sister's boys, years back, before they moved to Wichita. I'll dig it out." "You don't have to do all this," Callan said quietly. "The barn really would have been fine." "I know it would have been fine," Marielle said. "That's not the same as it being right." She looked at Junie, whose eyes had finally started to droop, exhaustion overtaking whatever fear or discomfort had kept her whimpering through the drive. "How long has she been out in this?" "Since about 4 this afternoon," Callan admitted, and something in his voice cracked open a little wider. "Truck died outside of Halvern. I thought I could get it running again. I know engines, mostly, but it wasn't the kind of broken you fix on the side of the road. I started walking because I figured somebody had to be closer than nobody." Marielle didn't ask the question sitting heaviest in the room. Where's her mother? Because she'd learned, in 3 years of grief, that some silences are their own kind of answer, and pressing on them too early only makes them bleed. Instead, she went to the hall closet, pulled down blankets that smelled faintly of cedar, and set about making the guest room ready while Callan sat in her kitchen, holding his daughter like the storm outside might still reach in and take her. It took the better part of an hour before Junie was finally asleep in the borrowed crib, an old iron-frame thing Marielle had wiped down and lined with blankets. And Callan came back downstairs looking like a man who had set down a physical weight and didn't quite know what to do with his suddenly empty arms. "Thank you," he said, standing awkwardly in the kitchen doorway. "I mean it. You didn't have to stop. Most people wouldn't have, not for a stranger on a night like this." "Most people haven't buried somebody," Marielle said, and then seemed almost surprised she'd said it out loud. She busied herself refilling the kettle to cover the moment. You learn things about strangers when you've been one yourself. Alone in a crowd, I mean. It changes what you notice. Callan was quiet for a moment, watching her with the particular attentiveness of someone who recognized a kindred kind of loss even before the details were spoken. My wife, he said finally, softly. Her name was Celine. She passed 8 months ago. Complications, after Junie was born. He stopped, shook his head slightly, as if the sentence had run out of road the way his truck had. I've been trying to figure out what comes next. That's mostly what tonight was. Trying to get to my brother's place in Redfield, 3 counties over. He's got work for me. Said we could stay with him a while till I get steady again. Truck just didn't agree with the plan. Redfield's a long way on foot, Marielle said. Everything feels like a long way right now, Callan admitted. And there was no self-pity in the way he said it. Just a plain, tired honesty that struck Marielle harder than any performance of grief could have. She recognized that flatness. She'd worn it herself, some mornings, standing in this very kitchen, wondering how she was supposed to keep doing ordinary things, making coffee, feeding chickens, folding laundry, when the person she'd built her whole ordinary life around simply wasn't in it anymore. You can stay a few days, she heard herself say, and some old, cautious part of her flinched at how easily the offer came. Till you get the truck sorted or figure out a ride to Redfield. There's work here too, if you want it. This time of year I could use another set of hands, and I won't pretend I've been keeping up with everything the way I should. Callan looked at her for a long moment, rain still ticking softly against the windows now that the worst of the storm had passed. You don't know anything about me, he said, not as an accusation, but as a genuine, careful observation. No, Marielle agreed. But I know what your face looked like when I saw you standing on that road with your daughter, and I know what it sounds like when a man's telling the truth about being tired. That's enough to start with. She turned off the stove, the kettle's low whistle dying into silence. Guest room's made up. You should sleep. Everything else can wait till morning. He thanked her again, quietly, and climbed the stairs to check once more on Junie before turning in himself. And Marielle stood alone in her kitchen a while longer, listening to the rain finally soften to a drizzle against the windows, aware of something she hadn't felt in this house in 3 years, the sound, faint through the ceiling, of another person's footsteps moving through rooms that had been empty for so long they'd almost forgotten what it was to hold anyone but her. She didn't sleep well that night, not from worry, exactly, though there was some of that too. A stranger under her roof, a man whose whole story she'd taken mostly on faith and the evidence of his eyes. Mostly it was something else keeping her awake, something she wasn't ready yet to name. The disorienting, almost painful sensation of a house that had learned to be quiet suddenly filled again, however briefly, with the small ordinary sounds of a family that wasn't hers. Morning came gray and washed clean, the storm having scoured the sky of everything but a few high, ragged clouds. And Marielle woke to a sound she hadn't heard in this house in 3 years, a baby's cry, muffled through the guest room door, followed by the low, patient murmur of a father's voice trying to soothe it. She lay in bed a moment longer than usual, listening, before she made herself get up and start the day the way she always did, coffee, chickens, checking the weather radio for what the storm had left behind. By the time Callan came downstairs with Junie balanced on his hip, dressed in a change of clothes he must have dug from his duffel, Marielle had breakfast half made and had decided, somewhere in the quiet hour of dawn chores, that she wasn't going to make this stranger feel like a burden in her house. There's eggs, she said, nodding toward the stove. And there's a high chair in the attic, too. Probably, if you want to go digging. Or she can sit on your lap. Either way, Junie, it turned out, was a watchful baby, dark-eyed and solemn in the way infants sometimes are, studying Marielle across the kitchen table with an intensity that made the older woman's chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. There was something about the particular weight of a baby's attention, unguarded, unfiltered by all the ways adults learn to hide their curiosity, that undid a person quietly from the inside. She likes you, Callan observed, watching his daughter track Marielle's movements around the kitchen. Babies like whoever's got the food, Marielle said, though something in her voice betrayed that the observation had landed somewhere deeper than she wanted to admit. Over the following days, a rhythm began to establish itself in the farmhouse, tentative at first and then, almost without either of them noticing the transition, settled and familiar. Callan turned out to be exactly what he'd claimed, good with engines, good with his hands, and grateful in a way that expressed itself not in words, but in effort. He fixed the hinge on the barn door that had been sagging since before Halden died. He mended fence line along the east pasture that Marielle had been meaning to get to for a month. He hauled feed and split wood, and did it all with Junie strapped to his chest in a carrier he'd salvaged from his duffel bag, the baby dozing against his heartbeat while he worked. Marielle found herself, against every instinct that 3 years of careful solitude had built in her, looking forward to mornings. "You don't have to work yourself like this," she told him one afternoon, watching him stack the last of the split wood against the side of the barn, sweat on his brow despite the October chill. "You're a guest, not a hired hand." "I'm not much good at being a guest," Callan said, with the first real ghost of a smile she'd seen from him. "Celine used to say I didn't know how to sit still even when the doctor told me to. I think it's easier, honestly. Working gives my hands something to do, so my head doesn't go where it wants to go." Marielle understood that more than she let on. She'd spent 3 years finding the same refuge in labor, in the particular mercy of physical exhaustion, the way a body pushed hard enough sometimes forgot, for an hour or two, what the heart was carrying. It was on the 4th evening, after Junie had been put down for the night and the two of them sat on the porch with mugs of coffee gone lukewarm in their hands, that Callan told her more of the story he'd been carrying since Miller's Curve. "Celine and I met in Halvern," he said, looking out at the dark line of the tree row against the last purple light of dusk. "She was a schoolteacher, 2nd grade. I was doing farm equipment repair, going place to place. We got married 2 years before Junie came along, and everything was," he paused, searching for a word that wouldn't feel like a lie by understatement. "Everything was good, genuinely good. Not the kind of good people say when they mean it was fine. The real thing." "What happened?" Marielle asked, gently, the question she'd been holding back since that first night. "Preeclampsia," Callan said. "Nobody caught it in time. Out where we were, small clinic, not enough staff, not enough equipment for what happened after. She held on long enough to see Junie born. That's..." His voice broke, just slightly, just enough that Marielle had to look away and give him the mercy of not watching. "That's the only thing I let myself be grateful for, some days. That she got to see her." Marielle sat with that for a long moment, the porch boards creaking softly as she shifted, an old grief in her own chest rising up to meet his. "Halden died on a Tuesday," she said finally, offering her own story the way you offer a hand to someone standing at the edge of the same water you nearly drowned in. "Tractor rolled on the slope by the north field. I found him myself. I keep thinking, if I'd gone out to check on him 10 minutes sooner." She stopped herself, an old habit of cutting off that particular thought before it could finish the sentence it always wanted to finish. Everybody who's lost somebody's got a version of that sentence, I think. The 10 minutes. The thing we tell ourselves might have changed it. "Does it get quieter?" Callan asked, the wanting to go back and fix it. "Some days," Marielle said honestly. "Other days it's loud as the first morning. I used to think there'd come a day it just stopped altogether, like a switch. It's not like that. It's more like, you learn to carry it different. Not lighter, exactly. Just different. So it doesn't knock you down walking across your own kitchen." They sat in silence after that, two people who had each, in their own separate storms, learned the same hard arithmetic of loss, and something passed between them on that porch that neither of them named yet. Not romance, not anything so simple or so fast, but a kind of recognition, the quiet relief of being understood by someone who hadn't needed the whole story explained to know exactly what it cost. It was Adeline Voss, Marielle's closest neighbor and oldest friend in the county, who first said the thing out loud that Marielle had been carefully not thinking. "You've got a man and a baby living in your house," Adeline said flatly, arriving unannounced on the 5th day with a casserole dish and an expression that mixed genuine concern with poorly concealed curiosity, standing in Marielle's kitchen doorway like she'd caught her friend in some act requiring explanation. "Whole town's talking, you know. Found on the road in a storm, staying at the Hartwell place. People love a story like that, Mari, especially when they don't know the whole of it." "There's nothing to talk about," Marielle said, more sharply than she meant to. "Man's truck broke down. He's got a 7-month-old. I wasn't going to leave them on the shoulder in that storm, and I'm not going to throw them out now just because it's giving the church ladies something to chew on." "I'm not saying you should," Adeline said, softening, setting the casserole down, and studying her friend's face with the particular attention of someone who'd known her since childhood. "I'm saying, Mari, you've had that look about you since I walked in. I haven't seen that look in 3 years. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm saying you ought to know it's there." Marielle didn't answer that directly. She busied herself with the coffee pot. The way she always did when a conversation edged too close to something she wasn't ready to hold up to the light. But that night, lying awake in the bed she'd shared with Halden for 12 years, she let herself admit, just to the dark, that Adeline wasn't wrong. There was a look about her. She'd felt it herself, unfamiliar and a little frightening, like a muscle that had gone so long and used it ached now just from moving. The trouble arrived, as trouble often does, wearing an ordinary face and driving an ordinary car. It was on the 9th day, a bright, cold Saturday with frost still silvering the fence posts, that a sedan Marielle didn't recognize turned up her long gravel drive and parked beside the barn. She was out checking the water trough when she saw it, and something in her stomach tightened before she even saw who got out. An instinct, she would later think, that had nothing to do with reason and everything to do with the particular stillness that came over Callan when he looked out the kitchen window and saw the car too. The man who climbed out was tall, gray-suited, official-looking in a way that immediately put Marielle on guard. He introduced himself as a caseworker named Griswold Pruitt from the County Family Services Office 2 counties over and asked, with careful, practiced politeness, if he might have a word with Mr. Marsh. Marielle watched Callan's face go through something complicated. Not surprise, exactly, but the particular dread of a thing he'd known was coming and had been hoping, against reason, might not come at all. "I'll leave you two to talk," Marielle said, though every instinct told her to stay, and she retreated only as far as the porch, close enough to hear the shape of the conversation, if not every word. It came out over the next uncomfortable hour, pieced together from what Griswold Pruitt said in his flat, procedural voice and what Callan, pale and quiet, admitted in return. After Celine died, in the disorientation of those first weeks, Callan had left the small apartment they'd shared in Halvern without properly notifying his landlord or updating any of the paperwork that connected him to Junie's care. Hospital records, the county's automatic flag on infant welfare cases where a single parent's address went dark. It wasn't abandonment, wasn't anything close to what the cold language of the case file might suggest, but it had triggered a wellness check, and a wellness check that turned up an unreachable father had, in the mechanical way these things sometimes worked, escalated into something with the weight of real consequence. "I need to see the child," Griswold said, not unkindly, but with the immovable patience of a man who had said this exact sentence in exactly this tone to 100 frightened parents before. "And I'll need to file a report on the current living situation. Mr. Marsh, you understand, an unregistered address, a minor traveling without documentation, an unrelated third party providing care. These are things that raise questions, whatever the actual circumstances turn out to be." Marielle came off the porch then, unable to hold herself back any longer. "He's not some drifter who wandered in off the road," she said, her voice carrying more heat than she'd intended. "I stopped for them myself. I saw the state that baby was in. If anybody in this county has questions about whether that child is safe, they can ask me, because I've watched this man work himself half to death these past 9 days making sure she is everything she needs." Griswold looked at her with the weary, unmoved patience of someone who had heard passionate defenses before and knew they weren't, strictly, evidence. "I appreciate that, ma'am. I do. But my job isn't to take anyone's word for it. It's to make sure the paperwork matches the reality, and right now, it doesn't. That's not a judgment on Mr. Marsh's character. It's a gap I have to close." What followed was among the hardest afternoons Marielle had spent in that farmhouse since the ones just after Halden's funeral. Griswold examined Junie, gently, professionally, noting her healthy weight, her clean clothes, the evident attentiveness of her father, and took photographs of the guest room, the crib, the kitchen where Callan had been preparing her meals. He asked Callan a long list of questions about Celine's death, about the broken-down truck, about his brother in Redfield, about his employment history, about why he hadn't simply gone to a shelter or a motel instead of accepting shelter from a stranger on a farm. Because she stopped, Callan said simply, at that last question, his eyes finding Marielle's across the kitchen. because a stranger stopped in a storm for two people who had nothing to offer her, and I didn't know how to say no to that kind of kindness. I still don't. Griswold Pruitt left that evening with a folder full of notes and a promise, or a warning, depending on how you chose to hear it, that he would need to file his report and that a follow-up visit, along with a formal hearing regarding Junie's custody arrangement, would likely be scheduled within the next 2 weeks. Until then, he said, Callan was not to leave the county without notifying his office, a restriction that landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything. That night, after Junie had finally settled into an uneasy sleep, Callan sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, and Marielle, standing in the doorway, saw in him the particular collapse of a man who had been holding himself together through sheer will and had, for the moment, run out of the strength to keep doing it. I'm going to lose her, he said quietly, not looking up. That's what this is building to, isn't it? Some judge is going to look at a file that says unregistered address, unemployed, unrelated caregiver, and they're going to decide I'm not fit, and they're going to hand my daughter to, I don't even know who. Celine's mother, maybe, who's barely spoken to me since the funeral because she thinks somehow it's my fault the hospital didn't catch it in time. Or foster care, while they sort it out. And I'll have failed the only promise I ever made to Celine that actually mattered, that I'd keep our daughter safe, that I'd never let her end up in the hands of strangers. Marielle crossed the kitchen and sat across from him, the same table where, 9 days ago, she'd made him tea he hadn't touched. You're not losing her, Marielle said, with more conviction than she entirely felt but needed, in that moment, to offer anyway. We're going to fix the paperwork. We're going to find you steady work, an actual address, whatever this county needs to see on a form to believe what's already true, that you are a good father who has been doing everything right since the worst thing in the world happened to your family. I've got a lawyer, Callan. Wexford Dunmore, does most of the county's farm and family law both. I'll call him first thing tomorrow. Callan looked up at her then, something raw and disbelieving in his face. Why, he asked. Why would you do all this for a stranger you found on the side of the road? Marielle considered the question longer than it probably deserved, because it was, she realized, a question she owed herself an honest answer to as much as she owed him one. Because 9 days ago, she said slowly, I was a woman rattling around an empty house, talking to the quiet because nothing else answered back, and you and that baby walked into it. And for the first time in 3 years, the house doesn't feel like a museum. I don't fully understand what that means yet, but I know I'm not going to sit here and let some caseworkers file take away the first thing that's made this place feel like a home again. Not without a fight, anyway. It was, though neither of them said the word aloud that night, the closest either of them had come to admitting what had been quietly growing in the space between them since Miller's Curve. The 2 weeks that followed were the busiest and most anxious of Marielle's life since the year Halden died. She called Wexford Dunmore the following morning, and he agreed, after hearing the details, to take Callan's case. Partly, he admitted with a dry laugh, because Marielle Hartwell asking him a favor was not something he was inclined to refuse, given the years of goodwill between their families, and partly because, in his professional judgment, the case Griswold Pruitt was building had far more procedural gap than substantive concern. The system doesn't care about the truth of a person's heart, Wexford told them both, sitting at Marielle's kitchen table with a legal pad and the particular unhurried patience of a country lawyer who had seen 100 families through worse. It cares about documentation, so that's what we give it. Employment, address, character references, a clean bill of health for the child, evidence of stable, ongoing care. We build a paper trail so thick nobody can argue with it. What followed was a kind of quiet, determined campaign the likes of which Marielle hadn't undertaken since the year she'd fought to keep the farm out of foreclosure after Halden's death. Callan took a part-time position at the county co-op, arranged by Adeline's husband, who managed the equipment yard, steady work, verifiable, with a supervisor willing to write a letter attesting to Callan's reliability and character. Marielle formally listed the farmhouse's guest arrangement with the county, establishing, on paper, a registered address and a documented childcare situation. Dr. Wynne, who'd tended half the babies born in Coulter County over the past 20 years, examined Junie and provided a glowing report on her health and evident attachment to her father. Adeline and half a dozen other neighbors, People who'd watched Callan work himself raw over those 2 weeks fixing fences and hauling wood without ever once being asked, wrote character letters that Wexford filed alongside the rest. Through all of it, something else was happening too, quieter and slower than the legal maneuvering, but no less significant. A real, undeniable closeness growing between Marielle and Callan, built not out of the drama of the custody fight, but out of the small, accumulated hours of shared life. Marielle teaching Callan her grandmother's recipe for chicken and dumplings on a rainy Tuesday. Callan teaching Marielle to change a baby's diaper without getting soaked in the process. Both of them laughing so hard at her first disastrous attempt that Junie, startled, joined in with her own delighted shrieking. Evenings on the porch that stretched later and later. Conversations that moved from grief to memory to, eventually, hope. The tentative, unfamiliar shape of a future neither of them had let themselves imagine in longer than they wanted to admit. There was a particular evening, about 10 days into the ordeal, that Marielle would return to often in her memory afterward. Junie had taken her first unassisted steps that afternoon, 3 wobbling, triumphant steps across the kitchen floor before landing, laughing, on her well-padded bottom, and Callan had scooped her up with such open, unguarded joy that Marielle had to turn away for a moment, overwhelmed by an emotion she didn't immediately have a name for. She did it, Callan said, breathless with the particular disbelief of a parent witnessing a milestone, holding Junie up so she could see her own achievement reflected in his face. Mari, did you see that? She walked. Marielle had, and something about witnessing it, about being present, by pure accident of a storm, for the ordinary miracle of a baby's first steps, settled into her chest with a weight she hadn't expected. She thought of the children she and Halden had tried for, quietly, for years, before doctors had finally told them, gently, that it likely wasn't going to happen for them, and how she'd grieved that particular loss so privately that even Halden, some days, hadn't fully known the depth of it. She thought of how strange and unearned it felt to be given. Now, this small, unexpected gift of witnessing a child's first steps in her own kitchen. Not her child, she reminded herself, not her family, not yet anything so certain as that. But it felt, in that moment, dangerously close to something she'd stopped letting herself want. You're good with her, Callan said later, after Junie had been put down, the two of them once again on the porch with the last of the evening light fading gold over the fields. I don't think I've said that plainly enough. You didn't have to be. You could have kept your distance, treated us like temporary guests, and none of this would have been wrong of you. But you didn't. You've been. He paused, searching for the word. You've been present. For both of us. I noticed that. I didn't plan on it, Marielle admitted. I've spent 3 years being very careful not to let anything in, Callan. It seemed safer that way. Fewer things to lose. And now, she considered the question with the same honesty she'd offered him that first hard night, when the caseworker's car had first turned up her drive. Now I think I forgot, somewhere in these past 2 weeks, to keep being careful, she said. I'm not sure I regret it. I'm just not sure yet what to do with that. Callan reached over, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away if she wanted to, and took her hand where it rested on the porch rail between them. She didn't pull away. I wasn't looking for this either, he said quietly. I want to be honest with you about that. I was looking for my brother's couch and a fresh start 3 counties over. I wasn't looking to fall for a widow farmer who stopped on a dead road in the worst storm of the year. But here we are, and I don't think either of us can call it an accident anymore. They sat like that a long while, hands joined on the porch rail, the fields dark and quiet around them. Both of them aware that whatever was growing between them now carried a weight neither of them could afford to be careless with. Not with a custody hearing looming. Not with a baby's whole future hanging in the balance of a stranger's decision. Not with 2 people who had each already learned, in the hardest possible way, exactly how much it cost to lose someone you'd let yourself love. Completely. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday, 3 weeks to the day after Marielle had first found them on Miller's Curve. And in the days leading up to it, a new fear crept into the farmhouse alongside the hope they'd been carefully building. The fear that all of it, the work, the paperwork, the character letters, the quiet growing love between 2 people who'd found each other in a storm, might not be enough to satisfy a system built to doubt first and believe second. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and clear, the kind of hard blue Coulter County sky that made everything look sharper than usual. and Marielle drove Callan and Junie the 40 minutes to the county courthouse in a silence thick with everything they hadn't said to each other the night before, both of them too aware of what the day might cost to trust their voices with small talk. The hearing room was smaller than Marielle had expected, more conference room than courtroom. A long table where a family court magistrate named Judge Prentice Aldine sat flanked by a court reporter and a stack of files that included, Marielle knew, 3 weeks of her and Callan's carefully assembled evidence. Griswold Pruitt sat at one end of the table with his own folder, and beside him, unexpectedly, sat a woman Marielle didn't recognize, until Callan went pale beside her and murmured, "That's Celine's mother." Dessa. Dessa Calloway had not spoken to Callan since the funeral, he'd told Marielle once, in a tone that suggested old wounds that had never properly closed, and her presence here now, at his daughter's custody hearing, sent a current of fresh alarm through the room that Marielle felt in her own chest. The proceedings began formally, Griswold laying out the timeline of events, the unregistered address, the wellness check, the discovery of Junie in the temporary care of an unrelated third party, in the same flat, procedural language he'd used that first afternoon on Marielle's porch. Then Wexford Dunmore presented their case. The employment records, the character letters, Dr. Wynn's report on Junie's health, and evident bond with her father, the documented, stable living arrangement of the past 3 weeks. It was going, Marielle thought, watching Judge Aldine's careful, unreadable expression, about as well as they could have hoped, until Dessa Calloway asked to speak. "I'm not here to make trouble," Dessa said, her voice tight with an old grief that Marielle recognized instantly, the particular rawness of a mother who had lost her own daughter and was terrified of losing what remained of her through her granddaughter. "I'm here because I lost Celine 8 months ago, and I have watched Callan fall apart in a way I understand, because I was falling apart too, and I didn't know how to reach him, and he didn't know how to let me. I have a stable home. I have resources. I have grieved this loss as deeply as anyone in this room, and I want to know why my granddaughter is being raised by a farmer none of us had ever heard of 3 weeks ago, instead of by her own family." The room went very still. Marielle felt Callan's hand find hers under the table, gripping tight enough to hurt. "Mrs. Calloway," Judge Aldine said carefully, "you're welcome to formally petition for a custody evaluation if you believe that's in the child's best interest. But this hearing today is specifically about whether Mr. Marsh's current living and care arrangements meet the standard of adequate, stable guardianship. That is a separate question from whether other family members might also be suitable." "Then let me answer the question you're actually asking," Dessa said, turning now to look directly at Callan for what seemed, from the sudden thickness in her voice, like the first real conversation they'd had since the funeral. "Is it stable? Is it adequate? I don't know. I know my daughter loved this man. I know she chose him, out of everyone, to build a life with. And I know that grief makes people do strange, unplanned things, leave apartments without notifying landlords, walk down dead roads in storms, stop for strangers when every instinct says to keep driving." Her eyes moved, unexpectedly, to Marielle. "I don't know you," she said, "but I've watched my son-in-law's face since we sat down in this room. And I've watched the way he keeps looking at you like you're the only steady thing left standing in a world that fell out from under him 8 months ago. That's not nothing. Celine would have wanted him to have that. She would have wanted Junie to have that too. Somebody steady, somebody who chooses to stay. It was not, in the end, a lawyer's argument or a caseworker's report that turned the hearing, but a grandmother's grief finding its way, unexpectedly, to Grace. Dessa withdrew any suggestion of contesting custody, asking instead, tentatively, almost shyly, whether she might simply be allowed back into her granddaughter's life, a request Callan answered before the judge could, standing up from the table to embrace his mother-in-law for the first time in 8 months, both of them crying in a way that had clearly been waiting a long time to happen. Judge Aldine, reviewing the remaining evidence with the room's emotional temperature considerably changed, took only another 20 minutes to render a decision. Full custody remained with Callan. The temporary living arrangement at the Hartwell farm was approved as stable and appropriate, and a follow-up review would be scheduled in 90 days as standard procedure, with no further concerns noted in the file. It was over. Just like that. After 3 weeks of fear that had settled so deep into Marielle's chest she'd forgotten what it felt like without it, it was over, and Junie, who had slept through most of the hearing in Marielle's arms, entirely unaware of how much her small future had hung in the balance of that room, stirred awake just as Callan turned to Marielle with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. "We did it," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "Mari, we did it." "You did it," Marielle corrected gently. "I just made the tea and drove the truck." "You did a great deal more than that," Wexford said dryly, gathering his files. "And we both know it." Outside the courthouse, in the hard, bright cold of the parking lot, Callan set Junie down between them, holding both her hands as she took a few wobbling, determined steps across the pavement toward Marielle, who knelt without thinking to catch her. This small, fierce, unexpected family that a storm on Miller's Curve had somehow, against every reasonable odds, brought together and then, through 3 hard weeks, proven worthy of keeping. "I need to ask you something," Callan said, watching Marielle hold his daughter, something in his face suggesting the question had been sitting in him a long while, waiting for the right moment. "And I need you to know it's not out of gratitude or convenience or anything less than what it actually is." Marielle looked up at him, Junie's small hand curled around her finger, the cold October sun bright overhead. "Ask," she said. "Would you let us stay?" Callan said, "Not as guests. Not temporarily, until I get back on my feet and we head off to Redfield like the plan always said. I mean actually stay, Mari. Build something real, together, in that house that's been too quiet for 3 years. I know it's fast. I know it doesn't follow any sensible timeline anybody would recommend. But I've spent 8 months being certain I'd never feel like this again, about anyone. And then a woman stopped for us in a storm, and everything got recalculated. I love you. I think I've loved you since around the 3rd night, when you told me about the 10 minutes you keep wishing you could go back and change. I just didn't know how to say it with a custody hearing hanging over both our heads." Marielle stood, Junie balanced on her hip now, looking at this man she'd found soaked and desperate on a dead road 3 weeks ago, who had walked into her carefully guarded quiet and, without ever meaning to, taught her how to want things again. "Yes," she said, simply, the word carrying the whole weight and relief of everything she'd been afraid to hope for since Halden died. "Stay? Both of you. Build it with me." The months that followed unfolded with the particular gentle ordinariness that Marielle had once thought was lost to her forever. Not the dramatic, cinematic sweep of the storm that had brought them together, but the quieter, more durable architecture of daily life shared between people who had chosen each other with open eyes and full knowledge of what loss could cost. Callan's truck, it turned out, was beyond saving, and he sold it for parts, using the small proceeds toward a second-hand pickup that became, within weeks, as familiar a fixture in Marielle's drive as her own. His job at the co-op became permanent, then became a foreman's position within the year, his steady reliability noticed by people who'd once only known him as the stranger who'd washed up at the Hartwell place in a storm. Dessa Calloway visited every few weeks from Halvern, her relationship with her granddaughter blossoming into something warm and unhurried, and her relationship with Callan slowly, carefully mending in the particular way that grief sometimes allows, once the sharpest edges have worn down enough to let 2 grieving people finally reach for each other instead of past each other. Marielle taught Junie to walk properly, steady and sure, across the same kitchen floor where she'd taken her first wobbling steps. She taught her, later, to feed the chickens, to pull weeds from the garden rows, to sit quietly on the porch at dusk and watch the light change over the fields the way Marielle herself had learned to do, first with Halden, and now, in a life she'd never expected to have again, with a family built out of a storm's strange mercy. She and Callan married the following autumn, exactly 1 year after Miller's Curve, in a small ceremony on the farmhouse lawn attended by Adeline and her husband, by Wexford Dunmore, by Dr. Wynne, by half the county who'd followed the story, quietly, the way small towns do, from stranded strangers to a family standing together under an arbor Callan had built with his own hands. The same hands that had once carried his daughter down a flooded road looking for anywhere dry to rest. Marielle wore a simple dress the color of wheat at harvest, and when she walked down the short aisle of folding chairs toward Callan, Junie, nearly 2 now, sturdy and bright, and utterly unbothered by the solemnity of the occasion, toddled alongside her clutching a fistful of dandelions she refused to relinquish even for the ceremony's photographs. And something about that small, chaotic, Joyful detail struck Marielle as exactly right, exactly true to how their family had actually been built, not with careful planning, but with mess and mercy and the willingness to say yes when a stranger asked for shelter in the rain. I keep thinking about that night, Callan told her, during the quiet after the small reception had wound down. The two of them standing on the porch where so much of their story had actually happened, watching the last guest's headlights disappear down the long drive. How close I came to not stopping you, to just keeping walking, hoping the next headlights might slow down instead. I keep thinking about how close I came to driving past, Marielle admitted. I had every reason to. Every hard lesson 3 years alone had taught me said keep going, don't stop for strangers on a dead road at night. And then I saw her little hand. She looked toward the nursery window, where Junie was finally, deeply asleep after a day too exciting for a toddler to properly process. I think some part of me knew, even then, that stopping was going to cost me something. I just didn't understand yet that what it would cost me was the loneliness I'd built my whole life around. I didn't know yet that losing that particular thing was going to feel like being given everything back. 3 years after that storm. 3 years, almost to the season, after Marielle Hartwell had pulled her truck onto the shoulder of a flooded county road for two strangers she owed nothing to. The farmhouse looked, from the outside, much the same as it always had. White clapboard weathered by prairie wind, a wraparound porch, a red barn standing sentinel against a wide Coulter County sky. But inside, everything had changed in the particular, cumulative way that love changes a house. Not through renovation, but through use, through the daily wear of a family actually living inside walls that had once echoed too loudly with absence. Junie was 4 now, a fierce, curious, endlessly talkative child who'd inherited her mother's dark, watchful eyes and her father's stubborn determination, currently engaged in the serious work of trying to teach the barn cats to fetch, a project meeting with limited success but undiminished enthusiasm. And beside her, toddling with the particular fearless wobble of a child not quite 2, was her little brother, Halden Marsh, named, with Callan's full and eager blessing, for the man whose farm had become the foundation for a second family he never lived to meet, but whose memory, Marielle liked to think, would have approved entirely of how his land and his name had come to hold new life again. Marielle stood on the porch one October evening, watching Callan chase both children across the yard in the fading gold light, their laughter carrying clear across the fields the way sound does on a still evening, and she thought, as she often did on evenings like this, about all the small decisions that had led to this exact moment. The decision to stay late arguing about seed at the feed store. The decision to keep driving that particular night instead of taking the highway route she sometimes preferred. The decision, in the half-second her headlights swept across a stranger's desperate silhouette, to take her foot off the gas instead of pressing harder on it. She thought about how easily, on any given one of those small decisions, this whole life might never have existed at all. How thin the margin had been between the family laughing in her yard right now and an empty house she might still be rattling around alone in, talking to the refrigerator hum for company. It was a thought that used to frighten her. In the early months, the fragility of it all laid bare. Now it mostly filled her with a fierce, grateful astonishment, the particular gratitude of someone who understands exactly how close she came to missing the best thing that ever happened to her, and who has decided, every day since, not to take a single ordinary moment of it for granted. Adeline still came by most weeks, casserole dishes traded now for the easier currency of old friendship secured, and she liked to tease Marielle, sometimes, about that first uncomfortable kitchen conversation, the one where she'd pointed out the look on her friend's face and Marielle had denied there was anything to see. "I told you," Adeline would say, watching Callan swing Junie up onto his shoulders while Halden shrieked with delighted jealousy at being left on the ground. "I told you that look meant something." "You did," Marielle would agree, every time, without a trace of the old defensiveness. "I should have listened to you sooner." "You listened exactly when you needed to," Adeline always said back. "Some things can't be rushed past their own timing, Mari, not even by nosy old friends." As dusk settled fully over the fields that evening, Callan came up onto the porch with a child under each arm, breathless and laughing, and set them both down to run inside ahead of him, their small footsteps thundering through a house that had, once, known only the sound of one woman's careful, solitary steps. "Good day?" he asked, settling beside her on the porch rail, the same rail where he'd first taken her hand 3 years ago. "Good life," Marielle corrected softly, leaning into him as the last light faded gold and then blue over the fields Halden had once worked and that Callan worked now. The same land, carrying forward into a future neither of the men who'd once called it home could have fully imagined, but which felt, standing here now, exactly as it was always meant to be. Inside, Junie's laughter rang out at some private joke with her brother, and Marielle smiled, listening to the particular, ordinary music of a house finally, fully alive again. Some storms, we spend our whole lives trying to avoid. The ones that catch us on dead roads at night, that strip away everything we thought we'd carefully secured, that leave us standing soaked and uncertain, waiting to see if anyone will stop. But every so often, if we're fortunate, if we're brave enough to take our foot off the gas when every old instinct says to keep driving, a storm turns out to be the very thing that leads us home, not to the life we planned, but to the one we didn't know. Until that moment, we were still allowed to hope for. Marielle Hartwell didn't stop that night because she believed it would change her life. She stopped because a baby's small fist was pushing against the rain, and because some part of her, buried under 3 years of careful solitude, still remembered how to answer a stranger's need with an open door. That single choice, ordinary, quiet, costing her nothing but a few minutes and a guest room, became the hinge on which an entire new life turned. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that kindness offered to a stranger can circle back around and fill the empty rooms in your own life, tell me where you're watching from tonight, and let us know in the comments which moment stayed with you the longest. And if you believe, as I do, that the right person can still find you on the worst night of your life, subscribe so you don't miss the next story like this one. Thank you for watching, and until next time, may you always have the courage to stop,